for an attack on this country. I wonder if you think the same kind of accountability from Donald Trump's appointees at the heads of Coates and Pompeo and Rogers, if you'd like to hear from all of them and know exactly what the president is briefed on when it comes to Russia.
Well, we have had an opportunity to talk with some of the president's cabinet members and close advisors. And to me, that report in the Washington Post rings all too true. It is very consistent with the character of this president that he cannot be told things that don't reflect well on him. So we have a situation, as the Post reported, where they have to structure his daily brief in a way that will not upset him like he's a child. On the other hand, Putin is more than capable of playing to the same insecurities that prevent our own cabinet from informing him of what Russia is doing. So Putin flatters him and says, why would they suggest, Mr. President, you didn't win this election legitimately, that we in Russia helped when that isn't true? These are talking points that could have been written by the White House, and they're coming from Vladimir Putin. I will say this, too, in terms of the president's repeated claims that everybody admits there's no collusion. Sorry, Mr. President, that is far from accurate. Indeed, when your son took a meeting with Russians with the promise of getting dirt on your opponent, that is very good evidence of an intent to collude with Russia. And when your national security advisor met secretly or spoke secretly with the Russian ambassador to try to conspire and undermine the bipartisan sanctions over their interference on your behalf, that, too, is a form of collusion. So hate to set the president straight, but that's the reality.
And just to what you're saying, I talked to someone today who made the same point, but they said that perhaps the reason he keeps repeating things like there's no collusion is, in addition to self-soothing, he's being spun by his own briefers, not the career folks, but that the career folks, we now know, have been told to put in writing intel on Russia because it may upset him. Do you think that the political appointees at the intelligence agencies should make clear what they have told the president about Russia? I've talked to folks who think we are more exposed than we should be for the 2018 and 2020 elections because there are not a lot of profiles and courage in that room with the president.
Unfortunately, I think that's exactly right. The role of our intelligence representatives, the heads of these agencies, as well as his cabinet, is to speak truth to power, not to tell the president simply what he wants to hear, but rather what the president needs to hear. And he needs to hear that Russia interfered in our election, that Russia continues to interfere in our affairs, that Russia is violating some of the nuclear treaties with us, that Russia is propping up a dictator in Syria, that Russia did invade its neighbor, that these sanctions are an important deterrent and you shouldn't undermine them. These are all things the president's advisors should be telling him. But we can see from some of the public statements of these very top people that far from telling him these things in the way they should, they're seeking even publicly to basically toe the White House line. And you see the CIA director, which was very disappointing, say that the intelligence community found that there was no effect on the outcome of the election by the Russians. That simply wasn't true. And if he's saying that publicly, then it raises a profound concern about whether he and others have the courage to tell the president the truth privately.
Congressman, you know better than I do the kinds of reforms that were made to the congressional oversight committees, or the congressional intelligence committees in terms of oversight after 9/11. I believe term limits were eliminated so that expertise could be built up, and that the idea was to have truly nonpartisan activities taking place in the House and Senate intelligence communities. I understood that to be the case for a good many of the years of sort of post-9/11 counterterror policy. And when I worked in the White House under George W. Bush, the committees were always briefed and often were in more agreement around those policies than the right and left debates that ensued in this country. Is that the case right now when it comes to policymaking, when it comes to sharing with the two committees equally with the Democrats and the Republicans, from CIA Director Mike Pompeo?
Well, I'll say this. The 9/11 Commission made a lot of recommendations about how to restructure our government to better protect the country. The Department of Homeland Security probably among the most significant results of that. The restructure of the intelligence committees, though, was probably the least implemented of the 9/11 Commission recommendations. We do still have term limits. We do have different people working on the appropriation of money for the intelligence agencies than those that are working on the authorization. And we still have term limits for committee members. So a lot of those reforms, in fact, did not go into effect. At the same time, the committee has been among the least partisan in the House, and it is very distressing to see now so many of my colleagues on the committee adopt uncritically the talking points from the White House. And you'll see many of our committee members say the same thing on the GOP side that the president is saying. And you see many of the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee echo the attacks on Bob Mueller and the FBI coming out of the White House. And from my point of view, it's a terrible capitulation to the power of the president and very much at odds with the kind of historical nonpartisan role of our committee, but also the obligation we have to the country to put the country first.
Do you believe the Republicans on your committee have promised the White House that the investigation into potential collusion with Russia will be done by the end of the year?
Well, it certainly seems they are acting on the and Steve Bannon's injunction. They need to shut us down. They need to shut the committee down. Now, we know the Republican senators were urged by the president to shut down the Senate investigation, and the Republican senators pushed back. The Republican House members on our committee, though, have not spoken out about whether the president reached out similarly to the House committee to shut it down, but they are taking steps to shut us down.
What kind of steps? I know they've scheduled 2 interviews in New York next week, one with the president's personal assistant on days when you all have other responsibilities. Is that the kind of, is that an example of what you're talking about?
It is an example. I can't go into the specific witnesses, but yes, they have scheduled witnesses out of state during a time when we're going to be in session voting on the tax bill. They're doing that so that the members can't be present for these critical interviews. And these are witnesses we've been asking to come into the committee for months and have been willing to come in. But they're making this last effort to get in a few key people before the end of the year. And they're refusing to schedule any of the witnesses to come in January. And there are literally dozens of witnesses that need to come before our committee who may never come before the committee if they shut this down. So I think they're on the verge, potentially, of reneging on the commitment they made to the public, to following the facts where they lead, because these witnesses are unquestionably relevant and important to the Russia investigation, and they're signaling we may never hear from them.
Do you worry that they're trying to shut down the investigation by year's end to lay the foundation for Donald Trump to fire Bob Mueller?
That's exactly what I'm worried about. I think that the sort of Bannon and his allies and the White House are making the argument we can't shut down Bannon while there are still congressional investigations going on. You need to shut those investigations down first so that we can put pressure on Mueller. So I think this is a concerted effort to deprive the country of getting to the bottom of what the Russians did and what help they may have had from the Trump campaign.
I think it's just a coincidence, then, that it would be the House Intel Committee that would, if Bannon, as you're saying, and Trump have their way, say that their investigation is over, they didn't find anything, wash their hands of it, permit Donald Trump then to wave something in front of the American people as an excuse to fire Bob Mueller. Do you think it's a coincidence, then, that the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, hails from the House, and that we now know from the Washington Post that the president is not briefed on the latest intel on Russia? I mean, does this feel fishy to you?
Well, you know, what seems fishy to me, honestly, is there are unquestionably a lot more witnesses and a lot of work that we need to do. And it's not as if the witnesses we've been bringing in have not borne fruit. We found out an enormous amount about connections between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And maybe from some of my GOP colleagues, we found out too much. Look what's in the public record already. The Russians approached the Trump campaign as early as April and told them, we have stolen Clinton DNC emails that we're offering to you. They approached the president's son and son-in-law and campaign manager and said, we've got dirt on Hillary Clinton. Will you play ball? And the campaign said, we would love to. Then you have the president trumpeting all of the information the Russians are publishing that was stolen from the Democratic Party. And then you have, when the Russians are caught and punished for it, you have the president's national security advisor designate conspiring with the Russians to undermine the sanctions that were penalizing them for their very intervention on Mr. Trump's behalf. All of this has come out with multiple indictments, some very recent guilty pleas, and the Republicans want to shut it down in midstream. plainly they're not interested, if they do so, in getting to the truth.
It's a great point. It's not like they're shutting down. It's not like they're shutting down something that isn't yielding fruit. Excellent point. As always.